The sound of a woman's voice carrying across the water stopped Henry Hartwell dead in his tracks, his horse whinnying softly beneath him, as though she too felt the haunting beauty of that melody drifting through the late afternoon air of Buffalo, Wyoming, in the summer of 1878. He had been riding hard for 3 days straight, chasing rumors of work at the cattle ranches that dotted the landscape around the Powder River, his leather saddlebags nearly empty, and his stomach growling with the kind of hunger that came from rationing hardtack and jerky for too long. The song reached him before he even saw the river through the cottonwood trees, a mournful tune in a language he did not recognize, filled with such raw emotion that it made something in his chest tighten with an ache he had not felt since his mother died, when he was barely 14 years old. Henry dismounted slowly, leading his mare through the dense brush toward the source of that extraordinary voice. The Powder River ran swift and clear here, fed by mountain snowmelt that kept it cold even in the height of summer, and there on a flat rock that jutted out over the rushing water sat a woman with hair as black as a raven's wing, cascading down her back in a thick braid. She wore a simple calico dress in faded blue, and her feet were bare, dangling just above the water's surface. Her eyes were closed as she sang, tears streaming down her brown cheeks, her whole body swaying slightly with the rhythm of her grief. He knew he should not intrude on such a private moment, but Henry found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move or look away. The woman's voice rose and fell like the wind across the prairie, carrying words he could not understand, but feelings he recognized all too well. Loss, loneliness, the kind of sorrow that settled into your bones and never quite left, no matter how many years passed or how many miles you traveled trying to outrun it. When the song finally ended, trailing off into the sound of rushing water and rustling leaves, Henry found his voice without quite meaning to. Even grief sounds beautiful in your voice. The woman's eyes flew open, dark and startling as a deer caught unaware, and she turned to face him with such sudden movement that she nearly lost her balance on the rock. Henry raised both hands in a gesture of peace, his own weathered cowboy hat clutched in one hand, his sandy brown hair falling into his eyes. "I did not mean to startle you, miss," he said quickly. "I was just passing through and heard you singing. I apologize for intruding on your privacy." For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her body tense as though preparing to flee. Then something in her posture relaxed slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "You speak English," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of an accent that suggested English was not her first language. "Yes, madam. Born and raised in Missouri, though I have been drifting west for the better part of 5 years now." Henry took a careful step closer, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. "My name is Henry Hartwell. I am looking for work in Buffalo. Heard they might be hiring ranch hands up at the Circle M." "Natalie Parker," she said after another pause, as though deciding whether or not to give him her name. "Though I was born Natalie Pawnee, before my father changed our name when I was small." The revelation explained the slight accent, the traditional melody she had been singing. Henry had encountered enough people of mixed heritage in his travels to recognize the signs, though Natalie's features suggested her ancestry was more complex than simple categories could capture. Her father must have been white, he reasoned, given the surname Parker and the fact that she spoke flawless English, despite that lingering trace of something else in her pronunciation. "That is a beautiful name," Henry said honestly. "Both of them. Was that a Pawnee song you were singing?" Natalie's expression shifted, surprise flickering across her face. "You know of the Pawnee?" "Some. I have traveled through Nebraska, met a few families who were trying to make a life on what was left of their land after the treaties." Henry moved closer still until he stood at the edge of the riverbank, close enough to see the dried tear tracks on Natalie's face and the redness around her eyes that spoke of prolonged weeping. "I am sorry for whatever loss brought you out here today." She looked away, her gaze returning to the rushing water. "My mother passed 3 weeks ago. The fever took her quick, before we could even get the doctor from town. My father buried her on the hill behind our cabin, but I cannot seem to make myself believe she is really gone. I keep expecting to see her in the kitchen when I wake up, or hear her humming while she tends the garden." "I know that feeling," Henry said quietly, his own memories rising unbidden. "Lost my ma to cholera when I was just a boy. For months afterward, I would turn around expecting to see her standing there, and every time the reality of it hit me fresh all over again." Natalie turned back to look at him, really look at him this time, and Henry felt the weight of that gaze like something physical. Her eyes were the color of dark honey shot through with gold, framed by thick black lashes still spiked with tears. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with perfect features and everything to do with the strength and sorrow written in every line of her face. "How did you bear it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "One day at a time," Henry admitted. "Some days I did not bear it well at all, but eventually the sharpness of it dulled into something I could carry without it cutting me quite so deep. The grief never leaves entirely, I do not think, but it becomes part of you rather than something that consumes you." Natalie nodded slowly, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "I do not know how my father is managing. He barely speaks anymore, just sits in his chair staring at nothing. All the ranch work has fallen to me, and I am trying. But there is so much to do, and I do not know half of what I am supposed to." An idea formed in Henry's mind, born partly from opportunity and partly from the inexplicable pull he felt toward this grieving woman by the river. "What kind of ranch does your father run?" "Cattle, mostly. We have about 200 head grazing on land my father bought 10 years ago, plus some horses and chickens. It is not as large as some of the operations around here, but it was enough to support us comfortably when both my parents were healthy and working." Natalie wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Now, I am afraid we will lose everything because I cannot manage it all alone, and my father has no will to help." "I could help," Henry heard himself say. "I am a good hand with cattle, can rope and ride and handle just about any job that needs doing on a ranch. I was heading to town to look for work anyway, and if your father is hiring, I would be glad to sign on." Natalie studied him with open suspicion. "Why would you want to work for us? You do not even know us." "Because you need help, and I need work, and sometimes Providence brings people together at exactly the right moment." Henry met her gaze steadily. "I am not looking for charity, miss. I would expect fair wages for fair work, but if your ranch is struggling, then I would rather put my skills to use helping someone who truly needs it than signing on with some big operation that already has more hands than they know what to do with." She considered this for a long moment, her teeth worrying at her lower lip. Henry could see the internal debate playing out across her expressive face, hope warring with mistrust, desperation battling with caution. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "Come back to the cabin with me," Natalie said, standing up from her rock and smoothing down her skirt. "Let me introduce you to my father and see what he says. I cannot promise anything, but if he agrees to hire you, then we will work out the details of wages and lodging." Henry felt an unexpected surge of relief and something else he could not quite name. "That sounds fair to me." They walked back through the cottonwood grove together, Natalie leading the way along a narrow path worn smooth by frequent use, while Henry followed behind with his horse. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it carried a weight of unspoken things, questions neither of them quite dared to ask yet. Henry found himself acutely aware of every detail about her, the way her braid swayed against her back as she walked, the straightness of her spine despite the grief that clearly bowed her shoulders, the competent way she navigated the uneven terrain in her bare feet without once stumbling. The Parker cabin came into view after about 20 minutes of walking, a sturdy structure built from hewn logs with a shake-shingled roof and a wide front porch. The land around it showed signs of careful tending, from the neat vegetable garden surrounded by a split-rail fence to the well-maintained barn and outbuildings visible behind the main house. Cattle dotted the rolling pastures beyond, grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. "My father built this place with his own two hands," Natalie said, following Henry's gaze. "He came west in 1858, young and full of dreams about making a new life. Met my mother a year later when he was trading in a Pawnee village. They married despite all the people who said it was wrong, who called my mother terrible names and treated my father like a traitor to his race. They loved each other fiercely, and they built something good here together." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, as was the pain of speaking about her mother in the past tense. Henry tied his horse to the porch rail and followed Natalie up the steps and through the front door. The interior of the cabin was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the summer heat. Simple but comfortable furniture filled the main room, including a large stone fireplace, a wooden table with 6 chairs, and several overstuffed armchairs near the windows. In one of those chairs sat a man who might have been anywhere from 45 to 60 years old, his face gaunt and gray, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. He did not look up when they entered. "Papa," Natalie said softly, crossing to kneel beside his chair. "Papa, I have brought someone to meet you. His name is Henry Hartwell, and he is looking for ranch work. I thought perhaps we could hire him to help with the cattle." Jacob Parker slowly turned his head to look at his daughter, and Henry saw grief etched so deeply into the man's features that it was painful to witness. "Your mother always handled the hiring," he said, his voice rough and broken. "I do not know what to pay him." "We will figure it out together," Natalie said gently, taking her father's weathered hand in both of hers. "But we need help, Papa. You know we do. The herd needs moving to fresh pasture, and there are fences that need mending, and I cannot do it all myself, no matter how hard I try." Jacob finally looked at Henry, really looked at him, and for a moment something sharpened in those grief-dulled eyes. "You know cattle?" "Yes, sir. I have been working ranches since I was 15 years old. I know how to move a herd, how to spot sickness, how to handle calving and branding and everything else that needs doing. I am a hard worker, and I will earn whatever wage you think is fair." $30 a month plus room and board," Jacob said after a long pause. "There is a bunkhouse out back with a stove and a decent bed. You will take your meals with us in the main house. We expect an honest day's work for an honest day's pay, and we do not tolerate drinking or gambling or bringing trouble to our door. That is more than fair, sir, and I accept." Henry moved forward to shake Jacob's hand, sealing the agreement. "I will work hard for you and your daughter. I promise you that." Jacob nodded slowly, then seemed to retreat back into himself, his gaze going distant once more. Natalie stood up, her expression a mixture of relief and sadness as she gestured for Henry to follow her outside. "Thank you," she said once they were on the porch again. "I know $30 a month is not much compared to what the big ranches pay, but it is what we can afford right now." "It is perfectly fair," Henry assured her, "and the room and board is worth more than you might think to someone who has been sleeping rough for the better part of a month." Natalie showed him to the bunkhouse, a small but clean building with a potbelly stove, a narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and several pegs on the wall for hanging clothes and gear. It was the nicest accommodation Henry had enjoyed in a very long time, and he said as much, which brought the ghost of a smile to Natalie's face. "I will ring the bell for supper in about 2 hours," she told him. "That should give you time to settle in and tend to your horse. The barn is that building there, and you can turn her out into the corral beside it. There is hay in the loft and oats in the feed room. Thank you, Miss Parker. I appreciate your hospitality. Please, call me Natalie. If we are going to be working together every day, formality seems unnecessary." This time her smile reached her eyes, if only briefly, "And I should thank you, Henry. You appeared today like an answer to a prayer. I did not even know I was praying. That must count for something." She left him then to return to the main house, and Henry set about unpacking his meager belongings and caring for his horse. The mare nickered appreciatively when he led her into the barn and removed her saddle, clearly pleased to be out of the sun with fresh hay to munch on. Henry took his time brushing her down and checking her hooves, using the familiar routine to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. He had left Missouri with nothing but a horse, a saddle, and a determination to find somewhere he could start over, somewhere the ghosts of his past would not follow. For 5 years he had drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, always moving on before anyone could get too close or ask too many questions. There was a darkness in his history, a violence he was not proud of, born from youthful anger and poor decisions that had cost him dearly. He had spent the years since trying to be a better man, trying to prove to himself that he was more than his worst moments. Looking around at the Parker Ranch, at the evidence of love and hard work and dreams built into every board and fence post, Henry felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, this place could be different, that maybe he could be different here. The dinner bell rang out across the property exactly 2 hours later, its clear tone pulling Henry from his thoughts. He washed his face and hands in the basin, changed into a clean shirt from his pack, and made his way to the main house as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Natalie met him at the door, her hair now pinned up in a neat bun at the nape of her neck, her expression composed despite the shadows under her eyes. "Supper is ready. It is nothing fancy, just stew and biscuits, but there is plenty of it." The food was far better than nothing fancy, rich and savory with tender chunks of beef and vegetables swimming in thick gravy, accompanied by fluffy biscuits that practically melted on Henry's tongue. He ate with the barely restrained hunger of someone who had been subsisting on trail rations for too long, while Natalie picked at her food and Jacob barely touched his. The silence at the table was heavy, but not hostile, weighted with grief rather than anger. "This is delicious," Henry said after his second helping, trying to inject some lightness into the atmosphere. "You are an excellent cook, Natalie. My mother taught me," she said quietly. "She said a woman needed to know how to feed her family well, that good food was an act of love." Jacob made a small sound, almost like a whimper, and pushed back from the table. "Excuse me," he muttered, standing abruptly and walking toward his bedroom. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Natalie closed her eyes, pain flickering across her face. "He does that several times a day. I do not think he knows how to exist in a world where she is not here anymore." They were so devoted to each other, so completely intertwined that losing her is like losing half of himself. "What about you?" Henry asked gently. "Who is taking care of you while you take care of him and the ranch and everything else?" The question seemed to startle her, as though no one had thought to ask it before. "I am managing," she said after a moment. "I have to. There is no one else." "There is me now," Henry said, "at least for the ranch work. And if you ever need someone to just listen, I am good at that too. Sometimes grief is easier to bear when you share it with someone else." Natalie looked at him with those extraordinary eyes, and Henry saw her walls crack just a little, saw the desperate loneliness beneath the competent facade she wore. "Why are you being so kind to us? You do not even know us." "Maybe that is exactly why," Henry said honestly. "Because I do not have any preconceived notions or expectations. I am just a stranger who heard a woman singing by a river and recognized the sound of a heart breaking. And maybe I also know what it is like to feel completely alone in the world, and I would not wish that feeling on anyone else." She studied him for a long moment, and Henry had the sense that she was seeing past his surface, looking for the truth underneath his words. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and began clearing the dishes from the table. "Tomorrow I will show you around the property properly," Natalie said, as Henry helped her carry plates to the wash basin. "You can get a sense of what needs doing most urgently, and we can make a plan for the work ahead." They fell into an easy rhythm, washing and drying the dishes together, and Henry found himself enjoying the simple domesticity of the task, the quiet companionship of working alongside someone else. When the kitchen was clean and the dishes put away, he bid Natalie good night and walked back to the bunkhouse under a sky full of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Sleep came quickly, pulled down by exhaustion and the comfort of a real bed, and Henry dreamed of dark rivers and haunting songs and eyes the color of honey gold. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the summer sun already warm by the time Henry emerged from the bunkhouse at dawn. He found Natalie in the barn, feeding the horses, dressed in men's work trousers and a loose cotton shirt, with her braid hanging down her back. She looked up when he entered, surprise flickering across her face. "You are up early," she said. "I thought you might sleep later after your long journey." "Ranch work does not wait for sleeping in," Henry replied with a slight smile. "Where would you like me to start?" They spent the morning riding the property lines, Natalie pointing out the various pastures and water sources, showing him where the cattle liked to congregate and which areas needed the most attention. The ranch was bigger than Henry had initially realized, covering several hundred acres of prime grazing land, with the Powder River forming one natural boundary. Natalie clearly knew every inch of it, speaking knowledgeably about water rights and grass quality, and the best routes for moving the herd between pastures. "Your father built something impressive here," Henry observed as they paused on a hilltop overlooking the valley below. "This is good land, well managed. He should be proud of what he has accomplished." "He is too lost in grief to feel pride right now," Natalie said, her voice thick with emotion. "Sometimes I worry he will never find his way back to himself, that the man my father was died along with my mother, and all that is left is this hollow shell going through the motions of living." Henry turned to look at her, seeing the fear beneath her words. Give him time. Grief is not a straight path, and everyone moves through it at their own pace. He may surprise you. I hope you are right. Natalie urged her horse forward, leading the way back down toward the home pasture. Come on, I want to show you the section of fence that needs mending most urgently. We lost 3 head last week because they wandered through a gap in the wire and got themselves stuck in the ravine. They worked together throughout the day, Henry's practiced hands making quick work of the damaged fence while Natalie held posts steady and passed him tools. She was strong and capable, never shying away from hard work, and Henry found himself impressed by her competence and determination. They talked as they worked, swapping stories about their lives, learning the small details that built understanding between strangers becoming friends. Henry told her about growing up in Missouri, about his father's small farm, and the way he had lost everything when his mother died, and his father turned to drink to numb the pain. He told her about running away at 15, about finding work on cattle drives and ranches across the West, about the freedom and loneliness of a life spent always moving, never settling. He did not tell her about the fight in Kansas when he was 17, about the man who had ended up dead from Henry's fists, and the way he had fled before the law could catch up with him. Some truths were too dark to share with someone you barely knew, especially someone who looked at you with growing trust in their eyes. Natalie shared her own story in turn, speaking of a childhood split between 2 worlds. Her father had loved her mother fiercely, but that love had come at a cost. White society shunned them, and the Pawnee people viewed her mother's choice with suspicion and disappointment. Natalie had grown up caught between, never quite belonging to either world, finding acceptance only within the walls of her family home. My mother taught me the old songs and stories, Natalie said, as they rode back toward the barn in the fading afternoon light. She wanted me to know where I came from, to understand that part of my heritage, even if the world tried to make me ashamed of it. The song you heard me singing yesterday was one she taught me, a mourning song meant to help the dead find their way to the spirit world. It was beautiful, Henry said softly. I have never heard anything quite like it. She had the most beautiful voice. Natalie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. People used to come from miles around just to hear her sing at church services. She could make the saddest hymn sound like something holy. They arrived back at the barn as the sun touched the horizon, both of them tired and dusty from a full day's work. Natalie disappeared into the main house to prepare supper while Henry tended to the horses. And when the dinner bell rang, he found himself looking forward to the meal with an eagerness that had little to do with hunger and everything to do with the prospect of sitting across from Natalie again. The days fell into a rhythm after that, a routine that brought structure and purpose to all their lives. Henry rose with the sun each morning and worked until dusk, tackling the endless list of tasks that any ranch required. He mended fences and moved cattle, repaired the barn roof, and cleared brush from the irrigation ditches, worked himself to exhaustion day after day, and found satisfaction in the tangible results of his labor. Jacob remained withdrawn, present in body, but absent in spirit, but gradually Henry began to see small signs of improvement. The older man started joining them for breakfast, then occasionally wandering out to watch Henry work, then finally picking up tools himself and contributing what he could even if he never spoke more than a handful of words at a time. And Natalie bloomed like a flower, finally getting enough water and sunlight. With the burden of ranch work lifted from her shoulders, she could focus on the house and garden and her father, could allow herself moments of rest and even occasional laughter. Henry discovered that beneath the grief and exhaustion lived a woman with a quick wit and a beautiful smile, someone who loved deeply and felt everything intensely. They worked side by side every day, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to grow between them. It started as friendship, as easy companionship and shared purpose, but gradually transformed into something more. Henry found himself watching for Natalie's smile, listening for her voice, finding excuses to stand close enough that their hands might brush when passing tools. And he saw the way she looked at him too, noticed how her gaze lingered, how her breath caught sometimes when their eyes met across the dinner table. It terrified him. Not because he did not want it, but because he wanted it so much. Natalie made him want to be the kind of man who deserved someone like her, someone good and honest and unafraid of the future. And he was haunted by the knowledge that he was built on a foundation of lies, that there were things in his past that could destroy this fragile new beginning if they ever came to light. 6 weeks after Henry arrived at the Parker Ranch, on a warm evening in late August, Natalie found him sitting on the porch of the bunkhouse, whittling a piece of wood into the rough shape of a horse. She climbed the steps and settled onto the bench beside him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. "My father spoke to me today," she said without preamble. "Really spoke, not just one-word answers to direct questions. He said he thinks you are a good man, and that my mother would have liked you." Henry's hands stilled on his carving. "That is high praise indeed." "It is." Natalie turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Henry, I need to tell you something. I need you to know that I am grateful for everything you have done for us, for the way you showed up exactly when we needed help the most. But I also need you to know that my feelings have become more complicated than simple gratitude." His heart was suddenly pounding hard enough that he could hear blood rushing in his ears. "Natalie, let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I find myself thinking about you when you are not here. I look forward to seeing you each morning more than I should. When you smile at me, I feel something warm unfold in my chest, something that has nothing to do with grief or loss and everything to do with possibility and hope. I did not expect to feel this way again, not so soon after losing my mother, but I cannot deny what is happening between us." Henry set down his whittling knife, turning to face her fully. "I feel it too," he admitted, his voice rough. "From the moment I heard you singing by the river, something in me recognized something in you. I have been running for so long, Natalie, always moving from place to place, never letting myself care too much about anything or anyone. But you make me want to stop running. You make me want to stay." "Then stay," she said simply. "Do not just work for us, Henry. Be part of this family. Let us build something together." He should have told her the truth then, should have explained about Kansas and the dead man, and the warrant that might still have his name on it, should have given her all the information she needed to make an informed choice about whether she really wanted someone like him in her life. But when he opened his mouth to confess, what came out instead was, "I would like that more than anything." Natalie smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her entire face, and Henry felt his heart crack open with longing and fear and desperate hope all tangled together. When she leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative and sweet, he kissed her back with all the tenderness he possessed, trying to pour everything he could not say into that simple connection of lips and breath and beating hearts. They courted properly after that, mindful of propriety and Jacob's watchful eye, even though the older man seemed more amused than disapproving of the romance developing under his roof. Henry and Natalie stole moments together when they could, conversations that stretched long into the evening, walks by the river where he had first heard her sing, stolen kisses in the shadow of the barn that left them both breathless and wanting more. Jacob continued to improve as the summer faded into autumn, slowly climbing out of the pit of his grief. He began working alongside Henry in earnest, taking back responsibility for the ranch he had built, offering advice and instruction with something approaching his old authority. He told stories about the early days, about meeting Natalie's mother and falling impossibly in love, about the challenges they had faced and overcome together. "Love like that does not come along often," Jacob said one evening as he and Henry repaired a gate hinge. "When you find it, you hold onto it with both hands and you do not let go, no matter what the world throws at you. I had 20 years with Mary, and I would not trade a single day of it even knowing how it would end. She was worth every moment of joy and every moment of pain. I am beginning to understand that," Henry said quietly, thinking of Natalie and the way she made him feel both terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Jacob studied him with sharp eyes. "You love my daughter." It was not a question, but Henry answered anyway. "Yes, sir, I do." "Good. She deserves to be loved by a good man." Jacob paused, then added, "But if you ever hurt her, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir. And for what it is worth, I would never intentionally hurt her. She means more to me than I know how to express." "Then I suppose I should start thinking about giving you my blessing," Jacob said, with the faintest hint of a smile. "Though you had better do things properly and ask her yourself first. Mary raised her to expect proper courtship, not some half-baked arrangement made between men without her input." Henry's heart leaped at the implication, at the future suddenly unfurling before him like a map of undiscovered country. "I will, sir, when the time is right." The time came in late October, when the cottonwood trees along the river blazed gold and the air carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Henry took Natalie riding to their favorite spot, a hilltop overlooking the ranch, with a view that stretched for miles in every direction. He had been carrying his grandmother's ring in his pocket for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. His nerves wound so tight he could barely think straight. They dismounted and stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Natalie leaning back against Henry's chest, while his arms wrapped around her waist. He could feel her heartbeat through the layers of clothing between them, steady and strong, and he gathered his courage. "Natalie, there is something I need to tell you." She turned in his arms to face him, concern flickering across her features. "That sounds serious." "It is." Henry took a deep breath, then another. "I have not been entirely honest with you about my past. There are things I have not told you, things I'm ashamed of, and you deserve to know the truth before we go any further." Her expression became guarded, but she did not pull away. "Tell me." So, Henry told her. About the fight in Kansas when he was 17, about the older man who had been terrorizing the workers on the ranch where Henry was employed, about how the confrontation had escalated from words to fists to something darker and more violent. He told her how the man had pulled a knife, how they had struggled, how Henry's youth and rage had overcome his opponent's experience. He told her about the blood and the horror of realizing what he had done, about fleeing in the night before anyone could find him, about the years spent looking over his shoulder, wondering if the law would ever catch up. "I killed a man," Henry said, his voice raw with emotion. "Maybe it was self-defense, maybe it was justified, but the fact remains that I took a life and then I ran rather than face the consequences. I have been running ever since, afraid to let anyone get too close, afraid that my past would destroy any chance at a future." Natalie listened to all of it without interrupting, her face carefully neutral, and when he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Henry braced himself for rejection, for disgust, for her to demand that he leave and never come back. Instead, she asked, "Do you regret it?" "Every single day," Henry said honestly, not defending myself, but the way it ended. The fact that someone died because I could not control my temper. I have spent 8 years trying to be better than that moment, trying to prove that I am more than my worst mistake. "And are you?" Natalie asked softly. "Are you more than that moment?" "I want to be. For you, for your father, for myself. I want to be the kind of man who deserves a life like this, a home, a family, a future. But I understand if you cannot accept what I have done, if you need me to leave." Natalie reached up and cupped his face in both hands, her eyes fierce. "I do not need you to leave. I need you to stay. I need you to choose us, choose this life, choose to keep being the man you have been since the day you walked into our lives. Everyone has done things they regret, Henry. Everyone carries shadows from their past. What matters is who you choose to be now, today, tomorrow, all the days after that." "You really mean that?" Henry's voice was barely a whisper. "With all my heart." Natalie kissed him then, deep and sure and full of promise. "I love you, Henry Hartwell. I love the man you are, the man you are trying to be, all of it, and I am not afraid of your past." Relief flooded through Henry so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. He held Natalie close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, and trying to memorize every detail of this moment. When he finally pulled back, he reached into his pocket with shaking hands and pulled out the ring. "This was my grandmother's," he said, holding up the simple gold band with its small garnet stone. "She gave it to my mother, and my mother gave it to me before she died. It is the only thing of value I own in this world, and I would be honored if you would wear it. Natalie Parker, will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Natalie's face as she nodded, her smile so bright it rivaled the setting sun. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit, how right it looked there. They kissed again, long and slow, and full of all the promise of the future, stretching out before them. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were laughing and crying at the same time. They were married in November, a small ceremony in the Buffalo church, with Jacob walking Natalie down the aisle and the local minister performing the service. Natalie wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit, and she carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers that still held their color despite the approaching winter. Henry wore his best clothes, freshly laundered and pressed, his hair neatly combed, and his hands trembling slightly as he slipped a second ring onto Natalie's finger to join the engagement band. The vows they spoke were traditional, the promises ancient, but Henry meant every word with an intensity that surprised him. To have and to hold, for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them. He had never expected to find this, a love that felt both safe and thrilling, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The reception was held at the ranch, neighbors gathering to celebrate despite the cold weather, bringing food and well wishes and music. Someone produced a fiddle and another a guitar, and soon the main room of the cabin was filled with dancing and laughter. Henry danced with his new wife, spinning her around the floor while she laughed with pure joy. And for the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Jacob pulled Henry aside later in the evening, when the celebration was winding down and the last guests were preparing to depart. "Welcome to the family, son," he said, clasping Henry's hand in a firm grip. Mary would have been so happy to see this day. She always worried that Natalie would end up alone, that being caught between two worlds would make it hard for her to find someone who could accept all of who she is. But I think you see her clearly, and I think you will make her happy. "I will spend the rest of my life trying," Henry promised. "Thank you for trusting me with her and with this ranch. I know I am not the son-in-law you might have imagined, but I swear I will work every day to be worthy of the faith you have placed in me." "You already are, Henry. You already are." The first year of their marriage was both challenging and wonderful, a period of adjustment and growth for everyone. Henry and Natalie moved into the main house, converting one of the spare rooms into their bedroom, while Jacob insisted on moving to the smaller room to give them more space. They negotiated the intimacy of shared living, learning each other's habits and preferences, building a life together, one day at a time. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Henry proved to be an excellent manager, implementing new techniques he had learned on other operations and making smart decisions about breeding and sales. Natalie handled the books and correspondence, her education proving invaluable as she negotiated prices and managed their finances with careful precision. Together, they expanded the herd and improved their land, slowly transforming the Parker Ranch into one of the most respected operations in the region. Jacob continued to heal, though he never fully stopped grieving for his lost wife. He spoke of Mary often, keeping her memory alive through stories and reminiscences, and gradually the pain in his voice when he said her name transformed into something gentler, something more like bittersweet remembrance than raw anguish. Spring came with its usual explosion of new life, calves being born in rapid succession, keeping all three of them busy day and night. Henry worked until he could barely stand, then stumbled to bed where Natalie would be waiting, and even exhausted they would reach for each other, finding comfort and connection in whispered words and gentle touches. One morning in early May, Henry woke to find Natalie already dressed and sitting by the window, one hand resting on her stomach, a strange expression on her face. He sat up immediately, concern flooding through him. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Natalie turned to look at him, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. But she was smiling too, a complicated expression of joy and fear and wonder all mixed together. "I am with child," she said softly. "I have suspected for a few weeks now, but I wanted to be certain before I told you. I am certain now." Henry was out of bed and across the room in an instant, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The reality of it crashed over him in waves, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Are you happy?" Natalie asked against his chest, her voice muffled. "I know we have not talked much about children, and with everything else going on with the ranch, the timing might not be perfect, but I am so happy I can barely breathe," Henry interrupted, pulling back to look at her face. "You have given me so much already, Natalie. A home, a family, a future I never thought I would have, and now this. A child. Our child. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." They told Jacob that evening over supper, and the older man's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He stood up from the table and pulled Natalie into a fierce hug, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Oh, my girl, my sweet girl. Your mother would be so proud, so happy. She always wanted grandchildren." Jacob's voice broke on the words, and he held Natalie tighter. "I wish she could be here to see this." "She is here," Natalie said softly, her own tears flowing freely. I feel her with me every day, Papa, and I will tell our child all about her grandmother, about her strength and kindness and beautiful voice. She will not be forgotten. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into summer. Natalie bloomed with health, her skin glowing and her eyes bright, though she tired easily and had to give up some of the heavier ranch work. Henry became almost comically protective, fussing over her constantly, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a plate. She found it both endearing and exasperating, but she let him mother her because she understood it was his way of dealing with his own fears about the birth and what could go wrong. They prepared the smallest bedroom as a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and building a cradle from smooth pine. Neighbor women stopped by regularly to offer advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, and Natalie spent her evenings sewing tiny gowns and blankets, while Henry read aloud to her from whatever books they could get their hands on. In late October, as the leaves turned gold again and the air grew crisp, Natalie's labor began. It was a long, difficult process that stretched through the night and into the following day. Henry paced outside the bedroom door, while the doctor and 2 neighbor women attended to his wife, listening to her cries of pain and feeling utterly helpless. Jacob sat with him, both of them silent and worried, praying for a safe delivery. Finally, after 20 hours of labor, a baby's cry pierced the air. Henry was on his feet instantly, his heart in his throat, waiting for someone to tell him what had happened. The door opened and the doctor emerged, looking tired but pleased. "You have a son," he announced. "A healthy boy with strong lungs. Your wife is exhausted but doing well. You can go in and see them now." Henry entered the bedroom on shaking legs to find Natalie propped up against pillows, sweat-soaked and pale but radiantly beautiful, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up when he approached, her smile tired but full of love. "Meet your son," she said softly, shifting the bundle so Henry could see the small face peeking out from the blankets. "I thought we could name him Matthew, after my mother's father, Matthew Jacob Hartwell." Henry reached out with trembling hands to touch the baby's impossibly soft cheek, overwhelmed by the tiny perfection of this new life they had created. His son. He had a son. The reality of it was almost too much to comprehend. "Matthew," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "That is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe how lucky I am." Jacob came in a moment later, his eyes already wet with tears before he even saw the baby. When Natalie placed Matthew in his arms, the older man broke down completely, sobbing as he held his grandson and whispered about how much Mary would have loved him, how proud she would have been. The early months with a newborn were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Matthew proved to be a demanding baby, crying often and sleeping in short bursts, keeping both parents up at all hours. But Henry found he did not mind the sleepless nights, or the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing. Every smile, every coo, every tiny milestone felt like a miracle. Natalie was a natural mother, patient and loving, and somehow able to interpret Matthew's needs with an intuition that amazed Henry. She sang to their son constantly, the same Pawnee lullabies her mother had sung to her, and Matthew would quiet immediately at the sound of her voice, his dark eyes tracking her face with rapt attention. They settled into a new routine, the 3 adults sharing the work of caring for Matthew while still managing the ranch. It was not easy, juggling all the responsibilities, but they made it work through teamwork and patience and love. Winter came hard that year, with heavy snows that kept them close to home for weeks at a time. They spent long evenings around the fireplace, Jacob whittling toys for Matthew, while Henry and Natalie took turns holding their son and talking about their dreams for the future. They spoke of expanding the ranch further, of building a proper house with more bedrooms for the children they hoped to have, of leaving something lasting and good for the next generation. "Do you ever regret it?" Natalie asked one night after Matthew had finally fallen asleep, and they were lying in bed together, Henry's arms wrapped around her from behind. "Stopping here, settling down with us instead of continuing to drift from place to place?" "Not for a single second," Henry said honestly, pressing a kiss to her shoulder. "This is everything I never knew I wanted. You gave me a home, Natalie. Not just a place to live, but a real home with people who love me and whom I love in return. You gave me a reason to stop running and start building. How could I ever regret that?" "I am glad," she murmured, lacing her fingers through his. Because I cannot imagine my life without you now. You appeared when I needed you most, like something out of a dream, and you stayed. You chose us, chose this life, even when it would have been easier to keep moving. That means everything to me." They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to Matthew's soft breathing from the cradle beside the bed, and Henry felt a contentment so deep and complete that it seemed impossible anything could threaten it. But of course, nothing lasts forever unchanged. The trouble arrived on a cold February morning in the form of two federal marshals riding up to the ranch with grim expressions and hands resting on their gun belts. Henry saw them coming from the barn and felt his stomach drop, knew with absolute certainty what they wanted before they even opened their mouths. The past had finally caught up with him. "Henry Hartwell?" the older marshal asked, his voice hard and official. "Yes." Henry forced himself to stand straight, to meet their eyes steadily, even though his mind was racing through options and finding none that did not end badly. "You are wanted for questioning in Kansas regarding the death of Thomas Brennan 8 years ago. You need to come with us." Jacob emerged from the house, alerted by the commotion, and Natalie appeared a moment later with Matthew in her arms. Henry saw the exact moment she understood what was happening, saw fear and betrayal and desperate determination flash across her face in quick succession. "There must be some mistake," Natalie said, moving to stand beside Henry. "My husband has been here with us for nearly 2 years. He has done nothing wrong." "Madam, the crime in question occurred 8 years ago," the younger marshal explained, not unkindly. "We need to take him back to Kansas to answer questions and possibly stand trial. If he is innocent, the law will prove it." "You cannot take him," Jacob said, his hand dropping to the rifle he kept by the door. "This man is part of my family. He has broken no laws here in Wyoming. Sir, I understand your feelings, but interfering with a federal warrant is a serious crime," the older marshal warned. "Please do not make this situation worse than it needs to be." Henry laid a hand on Jacob's arm, stopping him from reaching for the rifle. "It is all right. I will go with them. I always knew this day might come." He turned to Natalie, seeing tears streaming down her face, and felt his heart break. "I am so sorry. I should have been honest from the start about how serious the situation was. I let myself believe that. Because no one had come looking for me in so long, maybe they never would." "We will fight this," Natalie said fiercely. "We will hire a lawyer. We will testify on your behalf. We will do whatever it takes to prove that you are not the violent criminal they are making you out to be." "I do not want you spending money we do not have on lawyers and legal fees," Henry protested. "The ranch needs that money, and Matthew needs his father," Natalie interrupted sharply. "And I need my husband. So you will go with these men, and you will cooperate fully, and we will prove your innocence. Do you understand me?" Henry pulled her into his arms, careful not to crush Matthew between them, and held on as though he could memorize the feeling of her through sheer force of will. "I love you, both of you, no matter what happens. I need you to know that these past 2 years have been the happiest of my life. You gave me everything, Natalie, everything." "Then come back to us," she whispered against his chest. "Come back and keep living that life. Do not give up." The marshals allowed him a few minutes to pack a small bag and say proper goodbyes to Jacob and Matthew. His son looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, too young to understand that his father might not be coming home, and Henry kissed his forehead gently, breathing in the sweet baby smell of him. "Be good for your mother," he murmured, "and know that your papa loves you more than words can say." The ride to Kansas took nearly 2 weeks, much of it spent in silence as Henry tried to prepare himself for whatever was coming. The marshals were professional, but not cruel, allowing him adequate food and rest, answering his few questions about the legal process he was about to face. The trial itself was almost anticlimactic. It turned out that there were multiple witnesses to the fight, including the ranch owner, who testified that Thomas Brennan had been known for his violent temper and had instigated the confrontation. Several other ranch hands corroborated that Brennan had pulled a knife first, that Henry had only defended himself, that the death had been a tragic accident rather than murder. The prosecutor argued that Henry's flight suggested guilt, that an innocent man would have stayed to face justice rather than running. But Henry's lawyer, paid for by money, Jacob had somehow scraped together, painted a picture of a frightened 17-year-old boy who had panicked in the aftermath of violence, who had spent the subsequent 8 years living an honest life and trying to be better. Natalie arrived on the 3rd day of the trial, having left Matthew with neighbors and traveled all the way to Kansas to testify on her husband's behalf. She stood in front of the judge and jury and spoke with passionate conviction about the man Henry was, about his kindness and integrity, and the way he had stepped up to help her family when they needed it most. Whatever he may have done 8 years ago, in a moment of fear and self-defense, he has spent every day since trying to be a good man, Natalie said, her voice ringing clear through the courtroom. He is a devoted husband and father, a hard worker, someone who contributes to his community and helps those in need. If you punish him for defending himself against a violent aggressor, you are not serving justice. You are simply destroying a good man's life for no reason other than the letter of the law. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict of not guilty on all charges. The judge ruled that Henry had acted in self-defense and that while his flight had been foolish, it was understandable given his youth and fear at the time. He was free to go, all charges dismissed, though the judge warned him sternly never to take the law into his own hands again. Henry barely heard the words, too focused on the sight of Natalie rushing toward him, tears streaming down her face. He caught her in his arms and held on tight, relief and joy and residual fear all crashing through him in waves. "It is over," she kept saying, over and over like a prayer. "It is over. You are free. You can come home." They stayed in Kansas just long enough to handle the paperwork and ensure everything was properly filed, then began the long journey back to Wyoming together. This time, the trip felt completely different, the landscape bright with possibility rather than dark with dread. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, making plans for the future now that the past had finally been laid to rest. "I want more children," Natalie announced one evening as they camped under the stars. "I want Matthew to have brothers and sisters. Want our house to be full of noise and laughter and life. Is that something you want too?" "I want everything with you," Henry said honestly. "As many children as we are blessed with, as many years as we are given together. I want to watch our kids grow up on that ranch, want to teach them to ride and work cattle and love the land the way we do. I want to grow old with you, Natalie. I want it all." She smiled and kissed him, and they made love under the stars with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless. When they finally arrived back at the ranch a week later, Jacob came running out of the house with Matthew in his arms, both of them shouting with joy. "Welcome home, son," Jacob said, clasping Henry's shoulder with his free hand. "Welcome home." Life returned to normal, or as normal as life ever got on a working ranch. Henry threw himself back into the work with renewed dedication, determined to make the most of the second chance he had been given. The experience in Kansas had shaken him, forced him to confront the ways his past mistakes still had power over his present, but it had also freed him from the constant low-level fear that had shadowed him for 8 years. Natalie gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, in the spring of 1881. And then 2 years later came twin boys, Peter and Paul, who kept everyone running from dawn until dusk, chasing after their endless energy. The house they had dreamed of building became a reality. A large 2-story structure with 6 bedrooms and a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Jacob lived to see all his grandchildren born, remaining active and engaged until a peaceful death in his sleep in 1885 at the age of 63. He was buried next to Mary on the hill behind the original cabin, and at his funeral, Natalie sang the same Pawnee morning song Henry had first heard her performing by the river all those years ago. Her voice was still beautiful, still capable of transforming grief into something transcendent. The ranch continued to prosper and expand. Henry earned a reputation as one of the best cattlemen in Wyoming, known for his fair dealing and quality stock. Natalie became involved in the growing Buffalo community, helping establish a school and library, using her education and natural intelligence to benefit everyone around her. Their children grew up strong and healthy, each developing their own personality and interests. Matthew proved to have his mother's head for numbers and his father's way with animals. Sarah inherited Natalie's voice and her grandmother Mary's love of singing. The twins were inseparable troublemakers who nevertheless worked hard when necessary and showed flashes of the men they would become. More children followed over the years. Thomas in 1886, Ruth in 1888, Benjamin in 1890. The house that had seemed so large at first began to feel comfortably full, alive with the chaos and joy of a big family. Henry and Natalie somehow managed to give each child individual attention while also running the ranch and maintaining their partnership and romance. "How did we get so lucky?" Henry asked one evening in 1892 as they sat on the porch watching their 7 children play in the yard. Matthew was 16 now, already taller than his father, and taking on more responsibility around the ranch. The youngest, Benjamin, was only 2, toddling around on unsteady legs while his older siblings kept watch. "I do not think it was luck," Natalie said thoughtfully, her hand resting in Henry's. "I think it was choice. You chose to stop when you heard me singing instead of riding past. I chose to trust you despite not knowing you. We chose each other, and we kept choosing each other every day since. That is not luck. That is commitment and love and hard work." "You are probably right," Henry agreed, squeezing her hand. "Though I still feel lucky. Lucky that you were at the river that day. Lucky that you needed help exactly when I needed purpose. Lucky that you could forgive my past and see who I was trying to become rather than who I had been." "You made it easy," Natalie said softly. "You showed up as exactly who you were, broken pieces and all, and you stayed. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Henry. Your presence, your steadiness, your love. It got me through the darkest time in my life and gave me reasons to keep going." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set in a riot of color across the Wyoming sky. Sarah started singing as she pushed Ruth on the tire swing Henry had hung from the old oak tree, and her clear voice carried across the property, beautiful and pure. "She has her grandmother's gift," Natalie observed, pride evident in her voice. "Sometimes when I hear her sing, I can almost feel my mother's presence, as though she is here watching over all of us." "I like that thought," Henry said, "that the people we have lost are not really gone, that they live on in the memories we carry and the stories we tell and the gifts we pass down to our children." More years passed in the way that time does, each day blending into the next until suddenly you looked up and decades had flown by. Matthew married a girl from town in 1896 and took over day-to-day management of the ranch, allowing Henry and Natalie to step back slightly from the endless grind of physical labor. The other children grew and married and started families of their own, some staying close to Buffalo and others venturing out to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Henry's hair went gray and his joints grew stiff, but he remained active well into his 60s, still riding out to check the cattle, still fixing fences and mucking stalls when necessary. Natalie aged more gracefully, her hair showing only a few strands of silver, her face weathered but still beautiful, her eyes still bright with intelligence and humor. They became grandparents many times over, their house once again filling with children, though this time they were able to spoil them and send them home at the end of the day. The ranch thrived under Matthew's management, expanding to cover several thousand acres and employing dozens of hands. The Hartwell name became synonymous with quality cattle and fair dealing throughout Wyoming and beyond. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1909, Henry and Natalie returned to the spot by the river where they had first met. The cottonwood trees had grown taller, the path more worn, but the water still rushed over the rocks in the same eternal pattern. They sat together on the flat rock where he had first heard her sing, their hands clasped, their bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. "Sing for me," Henry requested softly. "That song I heard the first day, the morning song your mother taught you." Natalie smiled and began to sing, her voice not quite as strong as it had been 3 decades ago, but still beautiful, still capable of raising goosebumps on his arms and making his throat tight with emotion. The Pawnee words washed over him like a blessing, and he closed his eyes and let the sound fill him up. When the song ended, they sat in silence for a long moment before Henry spoke. "Thank you." "For what?" "For everything. For taking a chance on a drifting cowboy who had nothing to offer but his labor and his heart. For loving me despite my past and my flaws. For building this life with me, for giving me children and grandchildren and more happiness than I ever imagined possible. For being my partner and my love and my home for 30 years. Natalie leaned her head against his shoulder, her arm sliding around his waist. "The pleasure has been entirely mine, Henry Hartwell. You saved my life that day by the river, not in some dramatic way, but simply by showing up when I most needed someone to remind me that life was still worth living. You gave me hope when I had none, love when I thought I would never feel it again, a future when all I could see was loss. So, thank you for stopping to listen to a grieving woman sing. Thank you for staying. Thank you for loving me. They made their way back to the ranch as the sun set, walking slowly and leaning on each other for support, both physical and emotional. The big house waited for them, warm light spilling from the windows, the sounds of family dinner preparations drifting on the evening air. Matthew waved from the porch, his own children running out to greet their grandparents with hugs and chatter about their day. That night, lying in bed with Natalie curled against his side the way she had been for 3 decades, Henry reflected on the extraordinary journey his life had taken. From angry boy to running man to settled husband and father, from haunted by violence to blessed with peace, from alone in the world to surrounded by family. All of it because he had heard a song and stopped to listen, because a woman with tear-stained cheeks had taken a chance on a stranger, because love had somehow found them both when they needed it most. "I would do it all again," he whispered into the darkness. "Every moment, every choice, every challenge. It has all been worth it to end up here with you." "Me too," Natalie murmured sleepily. "Every single moment." The years continued to roll by with their inevitable momentum. Henry and Natalie watched their children and grandchildren flourish, saw the ranch continue to thrive under Matthew's capable management, lived to celebrate their 40th and then their 50th wedding anniversaries. They grew old together in the way that couples who truly love each other do, their bodies failing, but their connection remaining as strong as ever. In the spring of 1918, Henry fell ill with pneumonia. He fought it for 2 weeks, his breathing increasingly labored, his strength failing, despite Natalie's devoted nursing and the doctor's best efforts. On a warm May morning, with the windows open to let in the breeze and the smell of blooming wildflowers, he woke to find his entire family gathered around his bed. Natalie sat beside him, holding his hand, her face lined with age but still beautiful to him, still the woman whose singing had stopped him in his tracks 40 years ago. His children and grandchildren crowded into the room, ranging from Matthew at 53 to his youngest grandson at barely 3 months old. "This is quite a crowd," Henry managed to say, his voice weak but tinged with humor. "What is the special occasion?" "You are, Papa," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "You have always been the special occasion." Henry looked at each of them in turn, these people who existed because he had chosen to stop running and start building, because Natalie had chosen to trust and love and create a future with him. 7 children, 23 grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren so far, each of them carrying pieces of him and Natalie forward into the world. "I have had a good life," he said quietly. "Better than I deserved, better than I ever dreamed possible. You have all been my greatest joy, my proudest accomplishment. Live well, love fiercely, take care of each other and this land. That is all I ask." He turned to Natalie, squeezing her hand with what little strength remained. "Sing for me, my love, one last time." She nodded, tears flowing freely now, and began the morning song he had first heard her singing by the river in 1878. Her voice was thin and wavering with age and emotion, but it still carried that haunting beauty that had captivated him from the very first note. The Pawnee words filled the room, wrapping around everyone present like a blessing. And Henry let his eyes close and his body relax, ready to let go, secure in the knowledge that he had lived fully and loved well. "Even grief sounds beautiful in your voice," he whispered, just as he had said that very first day. And then, with his wife's song surrounding him and his family bearing witness, Henry Hartwell took his last breath and slipped peacefully away. Natalie continued to sing even after he was gone, her voice carrying the morning song all the way through to its end, honoring both her mother's memory and her husband's passing with the ancient words of her people. When the last note finally faded into silence, she leaned forward and pressed a kiss to Henry's cooling forehead. "Thank you," she whispered, "for hearing me, for stopping, for staying, for everything." She lived another 8 years after Henry died, remaining active and engaged with her family and community until the very end. When her own time came in 1926 at the age of 71, she died peacefully in her sleep, and her children sang the Pawnee morning song at her funeral just as she had taught them. They buried her next to Henry on the hill where her parents also rested, 4 graves looking out over the ranch that had been built by love and sustained by family. The Hartwell children and grandchildren continued to work the land and build on the foundation their parents had laid, generation after generation, each of them carrying the story of the cowboy who heard a woman singing by the river and chose to stop, and the woman who took a chance on a stranger and found a love that lasted beyond a lifetime. The house Henry built still stood 70 years later, a historical landmark in Buffalo, Wyoming, preserved by his descendants who continued to ranch the land and honor the legacy of their ancestors. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, people swore they could hear the faint sound of a woman singing in a language few understood anymore, her voice carrying across the water, beautiful and haunting and eternal.